hosted by EGROW Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare. And as you know, Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare is a policy-oriented think tank which focuses on research-based policy advice. In the last 1 year, we have made attempt to get the best minds from across the world to speak to us on contemporary issues. We have been very fortunate that we have really had a best mix of people coming from multinational institutions as well as in India. We have had academicians, policymakers across the world speak to us. We are also very lucky that two Nobel laureates, Professor Kramer and Professor Paul Milgrom, spoke to us recently, and of course, Professor Philip Aghian and Professor Friedman also spoke to us. Hausman Ricardo also spoke to us. Within our country, we have been very fortunate. The chief economic advisor of the country also has been with us. We have also had Professor Vivek Debroy, principal, the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, speak to us. The point that I'm making is we have made efforts to bring the best minds across the world, including India, to speak on contemporary issues. India is in the budget making phase. In that context, today we have the first presentation in that series from none else but Cerra Valerie from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund. To chair the session today, we have invited Professor Pinaki Chakraborty, Director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. In India, Professor Pinaki is a well-known name. He has been associated with UNICEF. He has also been associated with the National Statistical Commission. He was also a member of the member advisory council to the 15th Finance Commission. He has worked extensively on fiscal issues. He has authored several books. One of the most important books, according to me, is the book on GST, which was widely discussed. And he had to go and make his views, presented his views to the committee of the parliament. He has also been associated with the Expenditure Review Committee. He was the chairman, actually, of the Kerala Public Expenditure Review Committee, a statutory committee appointed by the government of Kerala. With this, I would now invite Professor Pinaki Chakraborty to chair the session and conduct the proceedings further. Professor Pinaki.
Thank you, Professor Singh, for kind introduction. And I think today's book discussion is critically important given the time that we are in. And this is a book which is probably the most appropriate book when the world is grappling with COVID and we are talking about life, livelihood, inclusiveness, and also in a context where inequality is sharply rising. So I'm really pleased to chair this session, and I am also very happy that EGROW is regularly organizing these meetings, which are extremely important for policy as well as for understanding what is happening in the frontiers of policy making and economics. So I would, I also welcome, and I'm really honored that this book is being discussed today, and I'll introduce the author. The author, this is a book edited by Valerie. Cerra, have I pronounced your name correctly? If not, my apologies. Barry Eichengren, Asma E. Gani, and Martin Snyder. And this book has, the title of the book is How to Achieve Inclusive Growth. And I'll briefly discuss the book, not take more than 2 minutes. Rising inequality and widespread poverty, social unrest and polarization, gender and ethnic disparities, declining social mobility, economic fragility, unbalanced growth due to technology and globalization, and existential danger from climate change are urgent global concerns of our day. These issues are intertwined. They therefore require a holistic framework to examine their interplay and bring the various strands together. Leading academic economists have partnered with experts from several international institutions to explain the sources and scale of these challenges. They gather a wide array of empirical evidence and country experiences to lay out practical policy solutions and to devise a comprehensive and unified plan of action for combating these economic and social disparities. This authoritative book is accessible to policymakers, students, and the general public interested in how to craft a brighter future by building a sustainable, green, and inclusive society in the years ahead. So let me introduce the author. Valeria Cerra is an assistant director in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund and was recently the division chief of the Inclusive Growth and Structural Policies divisions in the IMF's Institute for Capacity Development. She has been involved in policy advice, lending, and capacity development in the IMF's Western Hemisphere, Africa, European, and Asia and Pacific departments and the IMF Institute. She's published widely in leading economic journals, including the American Economic Review, Journal of Economic Literature, and Journal of International Economics on topics related to international macroeconomics, financial crisis, economic scarring, and inclusive growth. Her research has won the Emerald Award and has been cited by the media, including the Washington Post and the Financial Times, and by policy leaders, including US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Her most recent book on how to achieve inclusive growth, which we are going to discuss today, is due for publication in December 2021 by Oxford University Press. She obtained undergraduate degrees in finance and engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, a PhD in economics from the University of Washington, and is a chartered financial analyst. She has also worked in the US financial sector, conducting financial analysis for public and private sector clients. So over to you, Valeria.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the book, How to Achieve Inclusive Growth. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. And I'll give an overview of the book and pick out certain key messages from some of the chapters. And I look forward to a lively discussion. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay. So the usual disclaimer that the views are those of myself and not necessarily representing the views of the IMF or its executive board. Okay, so as mentioned, this book is co-edited by myself, as well as Barry Eichengreen, Asma El-Ghanani, and Martin Schindler. And it has contributors from 60 authors from many institutions and academia. You can see some of our academic contributors listed here. And as mentioned, we're expecting it to be published this month, and it will have free electronic access. So in this book, we're aiming to distill the lessons from academic literature and policy experiences all in one place, synthesizing knowledge on all of the relevant topics that are related to inclusive growth. And by doing so, we hope that the book can serve as a guide for policy action for country policymakers and for the economic community more generally. I've also noted that as a complement to the book, we've launched a free, excuse me, online course on inclusive growth on the edX platform. So let me first set the stage with the global context for inclusive growth. We have a lot of challenges facing the world today, which I'm going to get to soon, but it is useful to put everything in a long historical context. And against the backdrop of the long sweep of human history, global growth has been especially extraordinary over the last 200 years. We've had advances in technology and productivity, and that has helped us overcome what had been dire Malthusian predictions that population would outgrow food supply. Income per person adjusting for prices has risen from 2,000 to more than $50,000 in the US, and by a similar rate of expansion for the world on average, although at a lower level. Economic growth has powered improvements in living standards. So here you see a set of different indicators. For example, over 2 centuries, growth has reduced extreme poverty from 19 out of 20 people in 1820 to 2 out of 20 people in 2015, shown in the red in the top left graph. Likewise, there's been a dramatic rise in education attainment and literacy. There have been vast improvements in health and a strong increase in the share of the world living in a democracy. So this illustrates that growth remains an important component of inclusive growth. However, we know that growth and per capita income have been distributed unevenly across countries. For example, countries such as Malawi and Burundi receive less than $1,000 per person in comparable prices, compared with the US, Luxembourg, and other rich countries that have 80 to 100 times more income per capita. And these income differences are highly correlated with other disparities in living conditions, such as child mortality, life expectancy, years of schooling, and so forth. But even aggregate growth of a country is alone not enough, because increasingly economic well-being of any individual is affected by their economic status within their country. If we measure income inequality by the Gini coefficient, where a high value of the Gini means higher inequality, we can see that inequality has been rising since the late 1970s in most advanced countries and many emerging market economies, especially in Asia. The red and orange colors show a rise in net inequality, that means after taxes and transfers. According to some research, including that of Lucas Chancel in the World Inequality Report, the share of within-country inequality has been rising since the 1980s and now accounts for 3/4 of global income inequality. COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these inequalities. Now, usually within country inequality based on household surveys lags for a few years in when we get the statistics, so we don't yet have a systematic measurement across the globe. But we can already see that the pandemic's had a deeper impact on lower income countries. The IMF's World Economic Outlook shows that in emerging Asia and other developing countries, output and employment are significantly below their pre-pandemic trends, whereas they've rebounded in the US and other advanced countries. The degree to which countries have rebounded from the COVID crisis is partly related to the distribution of vaccines and access to healthcare, but also to the scale of the macroeconomic response. Even in previous recessions caused by financial stress and other shocks, research shows that a strong policy response can reduce output losses and scarring. For example, my previous research with Shweta Saxena and Ugo Panizza showed that the speed of recovery from recessions is highly correlated with stimulative fiscal and monetary policies and flexible exchange rate regimes. Economic losses are also strongly correlated with an increase in inequality. The left chart shows that countries that experience severe output loss relative to their pre-crisis trend are countries that also tend to experience a rise in inequality. Similarly, the right chart shows that inequality rose in countries with greater employment losses. The rise in inequality can lead to even further scarring effects. It can exacerbate poverty traps and social immobility. This chart demonstrates the so-called Great Gatsby curve. That is, countries that have a high level of inequality, which is measured on the horizontal axis as the Gini coefficient, are also countries in which a person's position in the income distribution is highly dependent on the position of her or his parents. So inequality tends to persist. So now that I've set this global context, let me turn to the framework for policy design. So to start with, we're all familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which focus on commitments to improve outcomes on 17 dimensions by 2030. Now, given that inclusive, green, and sustainable growth is multidimensional, we need a whole-of-government approach to policy design. But even more than that, we need a whole-of-the-economy approach to achieving inclusive and sustainable development. So in the book, we've developed an inclusive growth framework as a systematic way to analyze the economic interlinkages and help design appropriate policy responses. So first of all, promoting strong, sustained, and broad-based growth requires inputs from both the private sector and the government, and they combine to generate economic activity and determine its distribution. In most economies, private individuals and firms generate a substantial share of economic activity. So as shown here, they produce goods and services and earn income on inputs of labor, capital, and technology. These inputs can be derived from domestic sources or also from globalization, which adds labor, capital, and technology through migration, capital flows, and technology transfers across borders. In addition, the marketplace must be fair and competitive with level playing fields, both domestically and internationally. It needs to ensure appropriate prices and opportunities for all to contribute and reap the outputs of trade and production. The government provides inputs to establish the right conditions for growth and inclusion. Its governance framework establishes the rules of the game to direct how the country is managed and to hold political leaders accountable for making decisions in the best interest of the country. The political system creates opportunities for citizens to voice their views on social goals and advocate for reforms to promote inclusive growth. The government uses macroeconomic tools like fiscal and monetary policy to smooth economic fluctuations and avoid disruptive recessions and crises, which are detrimental to growth and equity. The government also contributes by providing an array of public services, such as health, education, and infrastructure. It then uses its tax and spending instruments to redistribute income so as to increase the welfare of the very poorest and reduce income disparities. Usually, the market outcomes are more unequal than outcomes after government redistribution through taxes and transfers. The private sector and government jointly generate economic activity and impact the distribution of income. And the result may be disparities in how economic benefits are shared, such as across genders and other personal attributes like ethnicity and race. In some countries, the young and the very old tend to be more vulnerable to poverty. Different regions of a country may grow at different rates, with some regions racing forward and others lagging behind. Economic benefits, including resource wealth, also need to be shared across current and future generations. Inclusive growth must be sustainable, and sustainability requires addressing the potential detrimental impact of climate change on future generations. And finally, there's a feedback loop, since inclusive growth is dynamic. Inequality, for example, can lead to political action, which would change government policies. And the final distribution of income also affects the private sector inputs by providing opportunities to accumulate human and physical capital and promote entrepreneurship. So the book is structured along the lines of the framework that I just discussed, grouped into the private sector inputs, both domestic and global, government inputs, and then the key disparities of outcomes. And one question that runs as a theme through the book is, well, do policies to improve inclusion come at the expense of growth? Or more generally, is there a trade-off between growth and inclusion? And actually, as we describe in the second chapter, causation goes in both directions. There are some mechanisms and policies that lead to a trade-off between growth and inclusion, but others that permit higher growth and equality at the same time. So, for example, higher growth can create more job opportunities, as well as providing resources for redistribution, lowering poverty and inequality. Conversely, depending on the source of growth, some sectors might grow faster than others, or the returns to capital and skilled labor might be higher than returns to unskilled labor, leading to inequality in the process of development. In the opposite direction of causation, policies that result in moderate inequality, which are based on rewards for saving, investing, studying, innovating, and taking risk, these can generate higher growth. But conversely, if inequality is too high, it could produce poverty traps, crime, and social conflict, which impair growth. So we need to be conscious of these various channels when we design policies. But if a society has equality of opportunities, a person's income tends to be determined mostly by their effort and ability. That provides incentives for hard work and investment in improving skills. So we do find that promoting equality of outcome, promoting equality of outcome through a lot of redistribution could have this trade-off between equality and growth if it discourages people from working hard and investing. But if we promote equality of opportunities, that tends to improve equality and growth at the same time, and there's not necessarily any trade-off. All right, so I gave you an overview of the framework and these themes about growth and inequality, whether there are trade-offs or not. As you've seen, there are many chapters in the book, and each chapter goes into detail on each aspect But what I'll do now is I'll pull out a few themes from some of the chapters, and let me start with the impact of fiscal policy on inclusive growth. So in terms of government inputs, we know that fiscal policy is a critical element in the government's response to inequality and poverty. Research finds that fiscal redistribution is more effective in advanced economies than developing economies, reducing the Gini by 0.11 versus only by 0.024 in developing countries. IMF work has also shown that transfers have had a greater impact than taxes on redistribution. Now, tax policy can involve some trade-offs between reducing inequality versus increasing growth and efficiency. So, for example, progressive income taxes can reduce inequality, but if marginal taxes are too high, it could discourage work and investment. The VAT is more efficient, but could in some cases be more regressive than a very progressive income tax. Now, there are some revenue policies that can improve efficiency and equality. So these include broadening the tax base, especially by eliminating non-means tested tax expenditures, correcting market externalities, especially, for example, those related to pollution and climate change, simplifying the tax code, and taking other measures to fight corruption and tax evasion, and taxing rents. Fiscal policy also reduces poverty by 2.25% on average in developing countries. And here nearly all of the impact comes from transfers rather than taxes. In addition, the composition of public expenditures is important for the impact on inequality. So you see in the right chart that there's a strong relationship between social spending as a share of GDP and reductions in inequality, which is intuitive. But it's important to keep in mind that the impact of fiscal policy on inclusive growth needs to jointly account for the revenue and expenditure side. For example, even if taxes alone result in little direct reduction in poverty and inequality, they do provide resources for transfers and social spending that can improve the lives of the poor. So efforts to mobilize domestic revenue can be impactful for inclusive growth. The state has a broader role than just its direct instruments and policy measures. The legal and political structure set the rules of the game and determine property rights. So institutions of governance also shape how successful the country is in spurring inclusive and equitable growth. And there are many dimensions to a country's governance, but avoiding corruption is an important component of it. Corruption can have a sizable macroeconomic impact. So some studies find, for example, that bribes account for as much as 2% of global GDP. And in all regions, there's a significant share of firms that report corruption as a top concern about the business environment. Corruption and poor governance can breed lack of trust in the government and undermine support for reform. So this is especially critical when the government wants to introduce a reform that has potentially large benefits over a longer horizon, but might entail some short-run costs. If citizens are suspicious of public officials, they may not tolerate reforms with short-run costs because they won't trust that the reforms will deliver the long-term benefits. Well, the government also has a crucial role in maintaining macroeconomic stability using its stabilization tools. And this is a topic that's fundamental to the work at the IMF. So we find, for example, that economic volatility and output scoring lead to income inequality across countries, but also within countries. So here it shows that countries that have high volatility of GDP per capita also have high volatility of unemployment and poverty. Therefore, it's critical to avoid scoring. Now, here I refer to some previous work. This is from an article published in the American Economic Review in March 2008, where Shweta Saxena and I presented evidence from a large cross-country panel showing that balance of payments and banking crises lead to a persistent loss in the level of output. So our analysis controlled for normal cyclical fluctuations in growth and showed that output would fall relative to a baseline and remain permanently lower following a financial crisis, as well as political crises. On average, the magnitude of persistent loss in output was 5% for currency crisis, 10% for banking crisis, and 15% for twin crises. In other research, we showed that recessions more broadly lead to persistent output loss. And this phenomenon is therefore not limited to financial crises. But as I already mentioned, we also found in other research that this output scoring or hysteresis can be reduced by fiscal and monetary expansions during recessions, as well as other policies like flexible exchange rate regimes. So counter-cyclical macro policy can not only reduce volatility, but it can also affect growth. So we found in our work then that output scoring also affects development. According to neoclassical growth theory, poor countries are expected to grow faster than rich countries due to diminishing returns to capital. In other words, in theory, each dollar of investment should be more valuable in poor countries that have little capital to start with. But the empirical evidence has not shown much support for convergence. And we argue that output scoring provides an explanation. So the chart shows a stylized model of development. The dotted lines illustrate that economic expansions in poor countries would be stronger than in rich countries in the absence of negative shocks. And over time, this would lead to convergence in the level of output per capita in line with the solo growth or the neoclassical growth theory. Now, both sets of countries are affected with negative shocks having persistent effects. These shocks can be either, it could be exogenous or external, or they could be due to domestic institutions and policies. But recessions in rich countries tend to be shallow and infrequent compared to those in poorer countries. So these large and frequent crises and recessions keep pushing poor countries back and prevent them from catching up. So now let me turn to highlight some of our findings about the links between globalization and inclusive growth. And here we find a distinction between the impact of trade versus financial integration. So there have been a lot of concerns about whether trade, and especially the rise of China, was adversely impacting the US. Now we've heard that some politicians argued it was because of bad trade deals, or others that trade was bad and we needed to protect against it. But that's not what we find. The empirical evidence shows a strong correlation between trade openness and growth. The debate in the literature is often about causation, and there's a long literature trying to address this using different methods. Each method has its shortcomings, but they all tend to find that trade raises growth. So aside from the chart on the left showing this strong correlation, there are also two other studies I highlight here from IMF economists. The middle chart takes an event study approach using exogenous liberalization episodes. And the right chart uses a gravity model applied year by year, but both approaches find that trade increases growth. But what about trade and inequality? Well, using the liberalization episodes again, this study finds that countries that liberalized had less rise in inequality than countries that remained closed. And on the right, the gravity model applied year by year shows that trade was associated with lower inequality. So panel data regressions also show that trade lead to less inequality in developing countries and no significant change in advanced countries. Trade's also associated with poverty reduction, although this does depend on institutions and complementary policies. So the left chart shows a positive relationship between an increase in openness and growth in the income of the poorest quintile. The right chart shows that the bottom decile gains more from trade than the highest decile of the income distribution. Now, it could be that this poverty-reducing effect of trade could arise indirectly because of the fact that the trade boosts growth. And in our book, we show that higher growth is associated with a decline in poverty. So trade has a lot of aggregate benefits. It increases productivity and innovation. It reduces prices, which particularly benefit the poor. But of course, within a country, there are different impacts across individuals, locations, and firms, depending on which sectors expand and which ones contract. And the impact also depends on the pattern of tariffs and other barriers. So my co-author from the WTO found that in India, people with lower levels of income tend to be employed in sectors that face higher barriers to export than people who earn more. Women face higher barriers at the border, such as higher tariffs in goods that women produce and consume, such as in agriculture and textiles. For India, my co-author found that the gap between what women pay and what men pay, the so-called pink tariff, is 6 percentage points. So that relates to the impact of trade. But we also did some event studies of countries that liberalized their capital accounts and compared them to those that remained closed. The impact of capital account liberalization is opposite of that of trade liberalization. In particular, the figures show that capital account liberalizations tend to raise inequality. Now, there's not much difference for creditor countries, but the impact is larger for debtor countries and for advanced economies. And the right-hand graph shows that reducing foreign direct investment restrictions leads to an increase in the Gini. However, FDI liberalization also leads to higher gross capital formation. So this could be an example of a growth inequality trade-off. Higher capital formation can increase income and growth overall, but perhaps it comes at the cost of higher inequality. And one explanation for this, for the rise in inequality, could be that technologies transferred by foreign direct investment often require the use of relatively skilled labor in the recipient country. So the wages of skilled and educated workers might rise more relative to unskilled ones. And indeed, this inequality increasing effect of inward FDI appears to be less in countries with higher levels of education attainment. So a higher level of human capital in an FDI recipient country will tend to limit the impact on the skill premium. So for example, between 1995 and 2015, more than 6% of the population completed tertiary education in emerging and developing countries that observed a decline in inequality, whereas only 2.5% of the population completed tertiary education in countries that experienced an increase in inequality. So the last chapter I want to touch on is related to climate change. Now, climate change affects sustainability of growth and inclusion for current and future generations, and it's simply an existential threat to all of us. Climate change brings about substantial socioeconomic damages, and it exacerbates poverty and inequality, even for small temperature increases. It disrupts agriculture, lowers labor productivity, leads to damage from natural disasters and sea level rise and the loss of biodiversity. Some research estimates that it's already increased between country inequality by 25% over the past half century. Some estimates project that under a business as usual scenario, 3.5 billion people, overwhelmingly in developing countries, will reside in areas with mean annual temperatures over 29 degrees Celsius by 2070. But the average annual temperature doesn't tell the whole story. The real danger comes from a dramatic rise in the number of days of extreme high temperatures, with an expected surge in heat-related deaths. Within country, climate change also disproportionately affects the poor. By 2030, it's estimated that it could push over 100 million people into extreme poverty, primarily because of disrupted food production, lower labor productivity due to deteriorating health, and natural disasters. And South Asia is one of the regions expected to be most affected by climate change. Climate change is linked to the three major pillars of inclusive growth: economic development, sustainability of growth and the physical environment, and inclusion, ensuring decent living standards for all. And it's going to entail a massive transformation across many sectors. So governments will need to employ a broad policy package to enable this green transition. So it's critical, for example, to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, which degrade the environment, deprive the government of revenue, and generally benefit the rich. Putting a price on carbon is a very critical element. It helps address the externality of the use of fossil fuel while also raising needed revenue for development. And this can be complemented with offsetting any impact on the poor or affected workers and businesses through transfers and social spending. The carbon pricing can be reinforced with sector-specific policies such as regulations, energy efficiency standards, and fee-bases. Policy measures to promote sustainable use of natural resources can also be taken, such as payments for ecosystem services, regulations, and reform in agriculture and water subsidies. Governments can boost public investment in sustainable and resilient infrastructure, including nature-based solutions, that is, restoring degraded lands and conserving ecosystems, which help mitigate the impact on the poor. The financial system should be aligned with climate objectives, especially in managing financial stability risks that are posed by climate change, as well as mobilizing resources for green investment. Another point would be information campaigns that can be implemented to try to steer social norms and behaviors to lower energy demand and lower the carbon intensity of consumption and business activity. It can educate the public about climate change risks, as well as providing services like early warning systems and evacuation plans in case of natural disasters. Insurance instruments and social safety nets should also be developed to help address the immediate impact of climate shocks. And this is all complemented with enabling policies like promoting active labor market policies and entrepreneurship, financial inclusion. It'll require regional investment strategies to help facilitate this transformation and transition to a green economy, especially for most affected workers and regions. But if done right, this transition to a low carbon economy can also create new jobs and opportunities. So for example, even though solar and wind are a small share of energy production in the US compared with coal, they employ almost 3 times as many workers. Mitigation and adaptation policies like land restoration and sustainable agriculture can also help poor subsistence farmers. Mitigation can provide important co-benefits. For example, switching to cleaner sources of energy and transport can help reduce air pollution, which is a major source of health problems and death, especially in developing countries. And on this, I just mentioned that in a 2017 study by some of my colleagues in the Fiscal Affairs Department, they estimated that annually increasing the tax per ton of coal by 150 rupees from 2017 to 2030 would avoid over 270,000 air pollution deaths, raise revenue of 1% of GDP in 2030, reduce carbon dioxide emissions 12%, and generate net economic benefits of approximately 1% of GDP. So since I have just recently moved to the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, I want to mention that there's considerable work at the fund on addressing climate change, especially in this department. So for example, experts in the Fiscal Affairs Department provide technical assistance on climate mitigation, but also in other areas such as green public financial management frameworks. So this adapts PFM, public financial management practices, to enable integrating the government's strategy to combat climate change and support environmentally friendly policies. So here I show some of its elements. Successful green PFM does have some prerequisites, such as a functional PFM system in place, political ownership, and developing green expertise. Green public financial management reforms constitute a whole of government undertaking, with the Minister of Finance as the custodian of public resources in the lead. Countries can look for smart sequencing of green PFM reforms. So this could mean starting with the budget formulation process, such as developing the capacity to assess ex ante the impact of fiscal policies, and later moving to measurement of actual results and impacts and comparing them to ex ante objectives. Gradually rolling out reforms, such as through pilots, can also be helpful. It's also important to communicate green PFM reforms to ensure buy-ins from stakeholders and to manage expectations. So finally, to learn more about the topics in depth of the book, I provide here the website for the book at Oxford's website and the online course. But now I think it's an opportunity to discuss questions and to hear from all of you. So thank you very much.
You're
I
not
think
audible.
we-
Yeah.
Perfect. Now I hear you. Great.
If there are questions, Charan, you,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Professor Pinaki.
Yes.
Yeah. May I, Charan, you would like to ask first? Or?
No, you please go ahead. I'll ask after you. And there are quite a few questions in the chat box also. We leave it to the chairman of the session to decide, answer each question separately or take a cluster of them. But you please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Cerra. I am Ashok Vishandas of the EGROW. Thank you, Professor Pinaki, for chairing, and this is a wonderful exposition you have given, and you have generated a lot of curiosity to read book. But very two, three, queries, questions, very briefly. First, you implied that agriculture sector faces higher level of tariff compared to all sectors put together. Is it India? Most of the country are facing the same kind of situation, or is it in Asian countries or something like this? That is question one. Second, the globalization you said has removed, reduced the poverty and the inequality to some extent. But what about the gated globalization? For example, Brexit, Britain moved out of the European Union. So in a sense, that is a gated globalization. And what is the impact of that event on the entire Europe and particularly to the Britain?
Okay, so first of all, on the questions on climate change, so the studies show, so natural scientists are studying the impact of climate on what's expected to happen physically to the world, and how it might change everything. And of course, the global climate is a very complex system, so there's a lot of uncertainty. But what the data do show are that some regions are more affected by others. And so I had shown you, for example, a map where expected temperature rises will be greater, especially in many regions where temperatures are already higher on average than in other regions. Among those, South Asia is one region, and also many parts of Africa. These are two critical regions where where temperature increases are expected to be higher, but also, as I mentioned, it's not just the average. There's some studies that show that compare the number of days of extreme temperatures. And so when you get the temperature rise, it's not just about the average, but about how many days are beyond the temperatures that are sustainable for human health. And even with a small degree, a degree or two of temperature rise on average, it can come with a significantly higher share of number of days where temperatures are beyond human capacity. Now, obviously, this has a lot to do with, the impact of that depends on how we adapt to those changes. So in some countries where it becomes hot, people can make adaptations. It's an obvious one is air conditioning. But this is intricately related as well to development and to having the resources to make those adaptations. So that's why I say that in climate change, one has to look at all three pillars of inclusive growth. It's the impact on sustainability of the environment, but also development and how these are intertwined. So one needs a framework of development that's also mitigating the climate change, but adapting to it as well. Now on Brexit and other
on the agriculture facing the higher tariff compared to all other sectors.
well, agriculture, of course, is affected because the changes, it isn't only just the change in the temperature, but it also the changes are related to differences in precipitation patterns. So now, of course, again, there's similar regions, South Asia and Africa and some others, could potentially be affected by changing patterns, which requires adaptation of agriculture to completely different circumstances. So that, again, that's a bit on how we adapt, but it could affect agricultural productivity. And we already see in many countries that there's increasing drought in some regions and increasing floods in others. So sometimes it might be hard to predict, but we know that it will lead to very different changes than the patterns that people have become used to. And so that requires adapting the practices to a new physical environment. So I hope that answered the question. On globalization, indeed, there was Brexit, but there was also, other countries, even in, I'm American, so in my country, there was a lot of policy to try to slow down trade. Of course, this was prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has led to a completely different issue in trade, which is disruption of supply chains. So I think, it may be a little bit difficult empirically to see the overall impact of these, given that the pandemic has disrupted the process and is a major shock. But I think what I know of research before that is that it did start to have some effect. At least anecdotally, for example, efforts to restrict or slow down trade with China and other countries in the US led to an increase in the use of capital. So this is one reason why we have to think of these systems in an integrated way. Because suppose, for example, that a country decides to shut down trade because, in the case of the US, the fear was China. That lower paid Chinese workers would be able to produce goods more cheaply than workers in the US, and this would disrupt jobs, especially in US manufacturing industry. So the idea was, okay, to protect those jobs, let's close the borders, or not entirely, but somewhat. Now, but in that case, that can lead to other economic behaviors, such as the substitute of capital for labor and increasing uses of robots and smart technology. And so I do think that there was some evidence of that happening a little bit because of these trade policies. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, just one more thing, one small point clarification. When you said that there is an FDI, it leads to reduction in the inequality. Is there, you have studied the time lag? Suppose FDI comes at time t, when the inequality reduction takes place on an average. Any you have studied the data from that angle, the time lag?
Well, the results, actually, the results were over a period. I don't recall off the top of my head what was, whether it was a 5-year lag or a 1-year lag. I would have to check detail, but it was, as I mentioned, it was a nuanced result, because in countries that were highly educated, the inward FDI actually reduced inequality. But in countries with lower education, tertiary education, that was associated with an increase in inequality. And so I explained that, that's partly because of, and this is true of trade too, especially when trade is also somehow bundled with FDI, is that when technology is imported, and think of FDI in some cases as transferring technology, then we do find that skilled workers are the ones that tend to benefit, are more in demand when there's an increase in technology, and so their wages will rise more than unskilled workers. And so that would be the mechanism. And that's also something we see, not even, forget about globalization, just the rise in the use of technology is one of the major factors for a rise in the so-called skill premium that we see in many countries in the world, where higher skilled workers, and especially college educated workers, their incomes have been rising, whereas especially in advanced countries, the lower skilled workers or less educated ones have had stagnant or declining real incomes.
Thank you.
Yes, Charan. Yes, Charan.
I had a few questions, and I leave it to you because of paucity of time. If you want to club mine, answering them along with the ones in the chat box. The first thought I had, Sarah, given your vast experience in a multinational institution, in the post-COVID time, what would be your recommendation to the emerging country in terms of aiding recovery? We all agree with your analysis. The income inequalities have widened. So, what would be your recommendation where all the thrust can be if the union budget has to be made, or we have state governments and they have to look into it? The second, there's been, I think, one of my colleagues at IIM Bangalore, Professor Shamal, and his other colleague, Professor Krishnamurthy, they had made a suggestion. They had said that with increasing income inequalities, maybe for 1 year, income tax can be either had a pause button or a threshold level decided on income tax, and beyond it people may pay, but a substantive threshold level so that people are able to recoup and recover. But the best would be to do away with it. And of course expenditure tax can always be there, or transaction tax is what they proposed. The third is, Professor, this is again coming, Sarah, from the vast experience that you have and IMF's writings on corruption. Now, you know that across the world, there's been very high corruption. There's a corruption index also. And you also know that in America, also at one point of time, it was very high. What are the recommendations that you would make? And I totally agree with you. Corruption sort of supports rising income inequalities. So, therefore, this is important. And are there any things that a union government or a state government in their budget do to reduce corruption? These three questions, please. Thank you.
Maybe I'll add, one or two questions from the chat box, which is and that are, closely related to the first question that Charan asked. There is one question which actually, which is to, which mentions what India should do in terms of its policies when it comes to achieving inclusive growth. And second question is about trade landlocked countries and its negative impact during the being landlocked, and its negative impact on the growth, and how do we deal with that?
Okay, Okay, these are all excellent questions. Let me do my best to answer them, but also be efficient in my answers. Okay, so in terms of recovery policies, and also specific to India on one hand and more general. Well, I think that it's very clear that it's critical for all countries, including India, in thinking about the recovery to make sure that first and foremost, the priority remains addressing the pandemic. And that means vaccine rollouts and access to health and other remedies. That's critical. And it also, because we remain in this pandemic and with the contagion effects and in some cases even rising cases and new variants, it's important that in the near term, governments, including in India, need to do what necessary to support not only the healthcare system, but also the incomes of those affected. So now, there's kind of a delicate balancing act here, because this kind of government support, which obviously entails fiscal resources, has already led to a rise in debt in many countries, in most, let's say, as well as private sector debt, by the way, not just government debt. So we also know that when debt becomes too high, that can lead to a debt crisis. And it could be especially troublesome if debt is held by foreigners and in foreign currency. Because we see when we look at the global economic outlook, we are anticipating this two-speed recovery, where in the US, for example, there's already discussion. The Fed discussed yesterday a plan to normalize monetary policy. That means some interest rate increases. So that could be something that spills over to developing countries, and especially problematic if debt is high and it leads to a higher interest rate on existing debt. So this is the balancing act. On the one hand, there may be a need for further increase in debt to provide the stimulus to address the pandemic and provide income support, but at the same time maintain that debt at a level that does not trigger unsustainable or debt distress down the line. And so that means having sort of a medium-term plan to bring the debt down, while at the same time providing that support in the near term. And so I think, that's the principal issue much for most countries, and that needs to be complemented by many of the usual recoveries, which is to begin thinking over the medium term as well, past the pandemic, of all of these policies, including those that I mentioned, of how to support inclusive growth and how to support sustainability. And as mentioned, there are some solutions that can address many issues at the same time. I know that something like a carbon tax can be politically unpopular, but it serves many benefits. It provides an increase in revenue, which can then be put to other uses, while at the same time helping to mitigate and adapt for climate change. So that's one example. There are other examples of, let me mention it in the context of the second question, which was related to the income tax. I mean, it's obviously for each country, determining the right tax structure requires careful analysis of the specifics of that country. So I don't want to give like India specific advice without a careful study, and my colleagues in the Fiscal Affairs Department do provide a lot of advice and technical assistance on tax policy design and on revenue mobilization. So let me say more generally that there are trade-offs in different types of taxes. So one asked about the income tax and thresholds and so forth. As I mentioned, income taxes are a very important part of the package of taxes and can be progressive when there are different rates. And it is useful. Often, I think almost all countries have some kind of threshold in which, you know, there's, if your income is below a threshold, you're paying no taxes. In some cases, submitting income taxes, there can be even earned income taxes that are negative and can help actually provide incentives for work. I think that, you know, in developing countries, sometimes the tax design is not only simply a matter of the policy rates, but also there are practical issues that are involved, like tax administration issues. Moving to electronic tax invoices in VAT and other things can be helpful. But it's, you know, one doesn't focus only on an income tax. There are many other taxes. And, you know, again, I'm not going to profess, I haven't been on a team looking specifically at Indian tax structures, so I won't want to comment, but I would say that in many countries where I have been the mission chief, and I'm aware of other countries too, there are also a lot of categories of so-called tax expenditures and various breaks, which create a very complex tax system and many loopholes. And so there are often opportunities to close those loopholes, make a more even playing field while raising revenues. On corruption and what can be done in the budget, I think that there are, you know, drawing upon resources, you know, including, as I mentioned, experts in my department that provide technical assistance on budget design, medium-term budgets, public financial management, that there, one aspect could be transparency of budgets. When budgets are transparent, public investment processes are transparent and applying very good processes, this transparency can help reduce the ability for corruption to take place. On landlocked countries and what can be done in terms of trade, I think that it is difficult. I mean, it depends on the physical nature of the landlock and whether there's a means to get goods to the market. But I would say increasingly for landlocked countries, one possibility would be, if it's infeasible to do physical trade, one can start to take advantage of more of the electronic trade and services, drawing upon technology and the connectivity that we have to trade technology related services. So that might be a possibility. But in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for raising some very critical issues and challenges we need to consider when we talk about inclusive growth, or to achieve, when we have to achieve inclusive growth. I think it was a wonderful discussion. You have talked about a framework for inclusive growth. I've talked about critical evidences related to what could make growth inclusive. And that includes macro, fiscal, trade, climate change, and then green PFM. I think it's a fascinating discussion and we have really enjoyed it. And at a later date, probably we could again discuss more in detail, maybe off the line on some of the issues that I think will continue to remain as challenge, like the fiscal management post COVID. I think, and investment redistributive fiscal policies. Charan mentioned about doing away with income tax. Some research that has happened in IIM. Yeah, I understand redistributive policies require, progressiveness, but if we also do not have taxes, we do not have, money to spend, and already global debt and both private and public have increased phenomenally in the last 20 months. And in case of India, if we look at, we are talking about reducing our debt to GDP ratio to 60% by 22-23, and that ratio is now at more than 90%. So, and that's only government's debt. We are not talking about public sector debt. We are not talking about debt of the quasi-public sector entities. So this is a very challenging situation that we are in because of the pandemic. And I hope we will have, as you also mentioned, I think I wanted to re-emphasize that we need to have a graded approach towards, fiscal expansion. I think there is limit to fiscal expansion, and as we see growth is recovering, I think it will be important that it becomes more inclusive, and then we have a sustainable macro policy, which later on, when the growth starts really picking up and we have more investment, we don't create instability in the system. Thank you very much for this very fascinating discussion.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you for excellent questions and a great discussion as well. And once again, I've been honored and pleased to be here with you.
Thank you. I must thank Professor Pinaki for chairing the session and making his observations as the chairman. He's so right, we need a graded approach. I must mention that I am Bangalore, three professors, Professor Shamal, Professor Krishnamurthy, and Professor Shankarshan Basu, had made that proposal, which I, on their behalf, asked. I also feel that in these difficult times, I totally agree with Professor Pinaki that given the constraints already on tax collection, how much liberal can we be? And when we speak about income tax pause, how long and for what threshold level? These are important questions. And therefore, these have to be debated upon and thought through. I must thank Professor Pinaki for his chairman's comments. I must thank uh, Dr. Cerra Valerie from the FAD to give us this talk, and all the participants who have been with us today and asking the questions. There are two important announcements which I need to make before we close. One is tomorrow we have Ambassador Sybil speaking to us on implications of India's foreign policy, important aspects. So I would invite all of you to be there. And another ambassador, Mr. Sikri, is chairing that session. Next week, on December 24, I'm aware it is the eve of Christmas, we are going to have another talk by two young professors, one from Georgia Tech and the other from London School, on tax incentives and small businesses. Now, these are two young professors, and therefore their work will be technical, but I would invite all of you to come and please participate in that session 2. The discussant is Professor Narayan, and the main speaker is Manpreet Singh. They are speaking on tax incentives and small businesses. So I would like even there all of you to come and speak there, participate there, and listen to their young minds as to what we can do in the post-COVID period. There's a technical paper that they have done, and they'll be presenting their findings. With this, let me then conclude today's session and thank each one of you once again for being here with us. And as any good lecture is, if it invokes thoughts and ideas, I think it is perfect policy lecture. And today's lecture has exactly done the same. It has triggered many thoughts in many minds, and that's, I think, the hallmark of a very good lecture. With that, thank you very much, and see you all tomorrow and next week too. Thank you.